The hearing room was silent, so still that the buzz of the fluorescent light sounded like thunder. Cameras zoomed in on the two women facing each other across the polished wood table, one cloaked in judicial calm, the other in unapologetic truth. Judge Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her tone cutting yet rehearsed. "Congresswoman, perhaps you're misunderstanding constitutional interpretation. It's not about feelings. It's about the law." Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze held steady, her expression unreadable. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the press row. She waited 3 beats, maybe 4, then spoke with a voice that landed like a gavel. "With all due respect, Judge," she said slowly, "a law degree isn't a license to forget the law applies equally." The words rippled across the chamber. Barrett froze. A senator's pen dropped. Even the court reporter looked up. Cameras captured the moment. Crockett, unbothered and precise, reclaiming the ground that had been stolen by arrogance. On social media, the clip would loop endlessly, Barrett blinking in disbelief, Crockett leaning back in quiet defiance. In that instant, titles meant nothing. Experience spoke louder than pedigree. The moderator tried to move on, but no one was listening. The silence had weight, the kind that follows truth spoken without apology. Barrett adjusted her papers, searching for composure, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed her. Crockett didn't need to press further. The statement stood on its own, etched in the air like a verdict. The camera panned the audience, staffers whispering, reporters tapping frantic notes, a few stunned faces breaking into smirks of awe. The tension had flipped. For once, the power dynamic had reversed, not through shouting, but through clarity. As Crockett gathered her documents, her expression said everything her restraint would not. She didn't need validation. The truth had already done its work. That clip, just 12 seconds long, would ignite a national conversation. Analysts would dissect it, opponents would downplay it, and supporters would memorize it like scripture. Because in that moment, America saw something rare, calm courage defeating condescension. But what sparked this exchange wasn't just disagreement. It was a clash of two Americas. Before the moment that broke the internet, the room had already been tense. It wasn't just another hearing. It was a public reckoning disguised as a policy review. The topic was equal access to justice. But beneath the formal language, everyone knew what it really was. A battle over who gets to define fairness in America. Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat poised behind the microphone. Hands clasped, her expression polished in patience. She spoke the way one might deliver a lecture to first-year law students, slowly, deliberately, with the quiet authority of someone certain she'd never been wrong. "The Constitution," she said, "is not a living document. It is fixed. Its words hold their original meaning, regardless of changing times or sentiments. To some, it sounded intellectual. To others, it sounded detached." Jasmine Crockett listened without blinking, her pen tapping lightly against the table. "So," she began, her tone even, "if the Constitution isn't living, what happens to the people who are?" A flicker, small, almost imperceptible, crossed Barrett's face. "Congresswoman, emotional arguments, however heartfelt, can't override textual integrity. We interpret the law as it was written." Crockett leaned forward. "And who was allowed to write it, Judge?" The question lingered like smoke. Barrett straightened, her smile thin. "The framers were men who owned people like me," Crockett interjected softly. "So when we discuss textual integrity, let's not pretend neutrality isn't a privilege." The air thickened. Some senators shifted uncomfortably. Others froze in quiet fascination. Barrett took a slow breath, regrouping. "Congresswoman, if we start revising our interpretation based on modern sentiment, we risk chaos. The law loses stability," Crockett nodded slightly, "and when we refuse to adapt, we risk injustice. The law loses humanity. That exchange alone could have filled headlines. But the true weight of it was still building the sense that something deeper was at stake." Crockett wasn't just questioning legal theory. She was exposing the gap between ivory tower interpretation and lived experience. Every question she asked was a mirror held up to privilege. Barrett tried to maintain composure, shifting back to safe ground. "Access to justice," she continued, "is not about perception but process. Everyone, regardless of class or background, is treated equally before the law. Crockett's eyebrow lifted, just slightly, that look every working-class viewer watching later would recognize. Everyone? She repeated. Tell that to the mother evicted without a lawyer, or the young man sentenced by a judge who didn't see his humanity. Quality on paper isn't equality in practice, Judge. The crowd's quiet hum grew louder, like the build-up before thunder. Crockett's voice stayed calm, deliberate, and controlled the way only someone who has fought too long to waste energy on anger can speak. Barrett gave a polite nod, masking irritation behind a judicial smile. Congresswoman, with respect, anecdotes don't change constitutional truths, Crockett replied. Then maybe constitutional truths need to meet reality once in a while. That was the pivot, subtle, but seismic. You could feel the divide sharpen. On one side, the authority of title and text. On the other, the authenticity of struggle and service. This wasn't a clash over interpretation anymore. It was a question of legitimacy, who gets to speak for justice itself. Every camera captured the growing tension, the unspoken challenge in Crockett's eyes, the slight tremor in Barrett's voice when she realized control was slipping. It was no longer an academic exchange. It was an awakening, one voice asking whether the law had forgotten the people it swore to protect. But beneath Barrett's smile, a quiet storm was brewing, and Crockett was about to unleash it. Long before that hearing, before the flash of cameras and the viral silence, Amy Coney Barrett had already been crowned by the establishment. Her story was one the elite loved to tell, a young woman who had climbed every rung of the academic ladder without ever missing a step. From her polished years at Notre Dame Law School to the marble halls of the Supreme Court, she was portrayed as proof that the system worked, that intellect and discipline alone could earn you power. But power, as the world would learn, isn't the same as understanding. At Notre Dame, Barrett had been a star, precise, devout, unquestioning. Professors called her a model of constitutional orthodoxy. She wrote essays defending textualism before most students even grasped what it meant. Her peers admired her brilliance, but whispered about her distance and how she never seemed moved by the human consequences of the theories she loved to cite. For Barrett, law was language to be preserved, not lives to be protected. Her ascent was as smooth as glass. Clerkships with conservative judges, invitations to elite symposiums, a teaching post at her alma mater where she lectured about the moral duty of restraint. Students described her as sharp, polite, and impenetrable. If you disagreed, she didn't argue. She simply looked at you with the serene certainty of someone who believed she was born on the right side of history. When she was nominated to the Supreme Court, the ceremony felt more like coronation than confirmation. Cameras caught her smiling as senators praised her intellect, her family, her faith, all the markers of credibility the powerful cling to when defending their own. She promised impartiality, reverence for the Constitution, and fidelity to original meaning. The words sounded noble, but to those watching from the margins, they also sounded like a warning. Because Barrett's original meaning had a record, one written not in ink, but in impact. Her rulings often read like academic exercises, elegantly reasoned, surgically cold. When workers fought for fair wages, she cited process over pain. When women fought for reproductive autonomy, she invoked tradition over reality. When racial discrimination appeared in disguise, she called it a matter for legislative correction. Her defenders applauded her consistency. Her critics called it cruelty dressed as order. To Barrett, empathy was interference, a bias to be purged, not a bridge to understanding. She believed justice came from distance, not proximity. That's what made her untouchable in conservative legal circles, and what made her dangerous to everyone else. Inside the judicial world, she was treated like a saint of reason, the embodiment of restraint and intellect. But to those outside that ivory tower, she symbolized the wall between the powerful and the people. Her speeches about discipline rang hollow in communities where discipline was survival, not philosophy. Her devotion to structure felt like mockery to those who'd been crushed beneath it. Every step of her career was built on reverence for tradition, for authority, for the myth that education alone ensures virtue. She had memorized every clause of the Constitution, but never seemed to hear the cries of those it left behind. And that was her flaw, the belief that the law's perfection made it untouchable, that justice could exist in theory, even when it failed in practice. There wasn't malice, it was insulation. She lived so high above consequence that empathy had become an abstraction. The irony was cruel but poetic. In a country born from rebellion, Barrett represented the return of aristocracy, not of birth, but of intellect. A quiet conviction that credentials conferred correctness, that the people's pain was too messy to fit into doctrine. She was the judge who treated compassion like contamination, reason like religion, and yet she believed herself benevolent. That was the tragedy of the ivory tower. It doesn't breed villains who know they're cruel. It breeds believers who mistake detachment for discipline and hierarchy for harmony. So when Barrett looked across that hearing table and saw Jasmine Crockett, a woman who hadn't been groomed by institutions, a woman who had built her voice from survival, she didn't see an equal. She saw a challenge to her order. Barrett's composure that day wasn't confidence. It was defense. Every careful smile, every clipped sentence was armor forged from privilege fragile, gleaming, and blind. She didn't realize that beyond those walls of precedent and prestige, the world had changed. People were no longer impressed by perfection that ignored pain. They wanted truth that could bleed and still stand. And when Barrett finally tried to assert her dominance with a lecture on constitutional integrity, she never saw the quiet smile forming across the table. The one that said, "Your rules don't scare me," because Crockett wasn't intimidated. Her education came from the streets of truth, not ivory halls. Before the marble chambers and televised hearings, Jasmine Crockett's world was smaller and tougher. The first courtroom she ever walked into wasn't lined with senators or scholars. It smelled of floor polish and fear. She was a public defender then, fresh out of law school, holding a case file that was thicker than her paycheck. Across from her sat a young man accused of theft, his hands trembling as if they were already cuffed. "Do you believe me?" he asked. She looked him in the eye and said the words that would define her career. "It's my job to make them listen." The trial was short, the odds stacked. The prosecutor spoke in polished sentences, confident, detached. Jasmine spoke with urgency, not from theory, but from truth. When the verdict came back not guilty, she didn't cheer. She just exhaled, the quiet relief of knowing that for once the system had bent toward fairness. That first win wasn't about victory. It was about possibility. In the years that followed, Jasmine saw the law's dual face noble in textbooks, brutal in practice. She defended tenants evicted without notice, teenagers profiled for their skin color, mothers charged for trying to survive. Her office was a patchwork of unpaid bills and handwritten thank you notes. Every case was personal. Every injustice was familiar. At community rallies, she stood on folding chairs with a megaphone, her voice hoarse but steady. "Justice isn't supposed to be exclusive," she'd tell the crowd. "It's not a luxury item for the privileged. It's a promise for the people." They believed her because she believed it too, because she had lived it. Her father had worked night shifts to keep the lights on. Her mother, a school teacher, once told her, "Never let someone's title make you forget your truth." That sentence became her compass. In every courtroom, every debate, she carried it like armor. When Jasmine finally stepped into politics, it wasn't ambition that drove her. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from watching the same injustice replayed for decades. She'd seen the law weaponized by those who spoke of order while ignoring suffering. So she ran for office not to join the system, but to confront it from within. Reporters called her unpolished. Colleagues said she was too direct. But voters saw something else: honesty. She didn't decorate her words. She delivered them like truth bombs wrapped in calm conviction. Her district, diverse, working class, overlooked, didn't want perfection. They wanted someone who understood what it meant to struggle with both hands tied. Crockett's rise wasn't powered by institutions. It was fueled by communities. Churches, union halls, school gyms. Those were her campaign headquarters. She won her seat not by courting donors, but by earning trust. Every vote was an act of faith from people who'd been told their voices didn't matter. In Congress, she carried that same raw energy. While others memorized talking points, She spoke from memory of clients, of neighbors, of the nights she'd fallen asleep on law books stained with coffee and tears. When she challenged policies that harmed the poor, her colleagues said she was too emotional. She smiled, knowing that empathy was the emotion they feared most. For Jasmine, the law was never abstract. It was human. Every statute had a story, every ruling a ripple in someone's life. That's why she refused to bow to authority cloaked in arrogance. To her, titles meant nothing without compassion, and that conviction is what made her dangerous, not because she was loud, but because she was right. Her staff often joked that Jasmine's real degree came from the University of Reality. She'd laugh, but they weren't wrong. She'd learned law from the people it failed, politics from the ones it ignored, and resilience from the ones it broke. Her resume wasn't built in ivory towers. It was carved in courtrooms where the carpet smelled of bleach and despair. Even as her name grew, she never lost that fire. When cameras rolled, she didn't perform. She represented. Every sentence she spoke carried the weight of the voiceless and the precision of someone who'd been dismissed too many times to waste words now. So when the day came for her to face Judge Amy Coney Barrett, it wasn't a clash of intellects. It was a collision of worlds, one polished by privilege, the other forged by struggle. As Barrett adjusted her glasses and prepared to lecture, Crockett remembered her mother's words echoing like a heartbeat. Never let someone's title make you forget your truth. And when Barrett tried to lecture her on the law, Crockett smiled because this was the moment she'd been built for. The hearing room buzzed with the sterile hum of microphones and tension. Cameras panned across the mahogany table, the air thick with unspoken rivalry. Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat composed, her smile poised like a mask, one that had weathered decades of deference. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her papers slowly, deliberately. The contrast between them was almost cinematic. The scholar versus the streetwise attorney. Privilege versus perseverance. Judge Barrett, Crockett began, her tone calm, respectful, precise. You've often spoken about the Constitution as a document of pure principle. But what happens when those principles only seem to protect the powerful? Barrett's lips curved, polite but dismissive. Congresswoman, that's an oversimplification. The law doesn't favor anyone. It's neutral. It's the interpreter's bias that often creates imbalance. Crockett nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement but also of quiet challenge. Then would you agree that bias becomes law when those interpreting it refuse to see their own privilege? Barrett leaned forward. Congresswoman, I'd advise you to mind your tone. This is a legal discussion, not a rally. A murmur rippled through the room. The cameras caught the faint, visible tightening of Crockett's jaw. She inhaled once, slow, steady. Restraint looked effortless on her, but inside, she was taking inventory. Every interruption, every deflection, every woman told to mind her tone for daring to question authority. Understood, Judge, she replied evenly. Then let's keep it legal. The next question is sliced cleaner. In your rulings on workplace discrimination, you wrote that intent matters more than impact. Tell me, Judge, when was the last time you intentionally paid someone's rent? Barrett blinked. Her silence was brief, but enough for the audience to sense imbalance. She tried to recover. The law requires objective analysis, not emotional reactions. We can't legislate based on feelings, Crockett didn't flinch. But we can legislate fairness. And fairness doesn't come from emotion. It comes from empathy, which the law was meant to protect. Reporters exchanged glances, fingers twitching over keyboards. The temperature in the room had shifted. Barrett straightened her posture, searching for her footing. Congresswoman, you seem to misunderstand judicial restraint, Barrett pressed. We interpret. We don't empathize. That's your branch's job. Crockett tilted her head slightly, voice still calm. So empathy, in your view, is a weakness in law? A flicker. Just a flicker. Barrett hesitated, the kind of hesitation that cameras love. I didn't say that, Barrett replied curtly. You implied it? Crockett countered softly. The senators watching leaned forward. The sound of tapping pens ceased. Barrett's composure was thinning her carefully cultivated distance, starting to look like detachment. Crockett continued, voice even but rising in power. You interpret the law as if it lives in a vacuum. But every ruling you make has a heartbeat on the other side. People who can't afford lawyers, who can't quote Latin, who don't have the luxury of being theoretical about justice. Barrett's expression tightened. That's rhetoric, not jurisprudence. Maybe, Crockett said, her gaze unwavering. But rhetoric built this country. And if you can't see who the law leaves behind, maybe your interpretation isn't restraint. Maybe it's neglect. Gasps. Not loud, but audible. The kind that makes every camera zoom in. Barrett's eyes narrowed. She tried to reassert control. Congresswoman, if you're questioning my qualifications, I'm questioning your connection, Crockett interrupted gently. Because credentials don't mean comprehension. You can know the law and still not understand justice. Barrett's face flushed slightly, the first visible crack in her marble composure. One of the senators shifted in his seat. Another whispered to a staffer. Every lens focused on the two women now locked in a silent power struggle. Barrett's next words came clipped. With all due respect, my record speaks for itself. Crockett smiled faintly. So does mine. Silence. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade. Barrett's confidence flickered, caught between indignation and disbelief at being challenged so deftly. Crockett's calm radiated through the tension like still water before a storm. She leaned forward, voice low but deliberate, eyes locked on Barrett's. The audience held its breath, and then Crockett leaned forward, just 4 words that flipped the entire room. The silence that followed felt sacred, the kind that only comes before something seismic. You could hear the shuffle of a paper, the nervous click of a pen somewhere in the back row, the collective inhale of a nation waiting to see if Jasmine Crockett would flinch. But she didn't. She leaned forward, eyes steady, voice calm enough to slice through the air like a gavel of truth. With all due respect, Judge, she began, her tone neither defensive nor deferential. A law degree isn't a license to forget the law applies equally. Barrett blinked. Once, twice. The words landed with surgical precision. No theatrics, no volume, just truth. Unshaken and immovable. It was the kind of statement that didn't need to echo, because it instantly rewrote the room's atmosphere. For a second, Barrett tried to respond, but nothing came. She adjusted her papers, reached for composure, found none. The microphone seemed to hum louder, catching the faint quiver in her breath. Crockett didn't rush. She allowed the silence to stretch, to breathe, to sting. See, she continued softly, the law isn't a ladder to climb, it's a balance to hold. You've spent your career defending the idea that justice must be blind. But what good is blindness if it refuses to see the people it serves? A murmur spread through the hearing room. One senator tried to hide a grin. Another sat back, crossing his arms, pretending to study his notes but clearly absorbing every word. Barrett shifted again, her smile tightening. Congresswoman, I think you're misunderstanding I understand perfectly. Crockett interrupted, not harshly but with precision. You believe fairness is found in detachment, that the farther you stand from the world, the clearer you can see it. But the truth, Judge, is that distance doesn't give clarity, it gives comfort. And comfort has never been justice's friend. Gasps, the kind that feels like oxygen catching flame. Barrett's eyes darted toward the senators, perhaps hoping someone would interject, deflect, save her from the mounting moral gravity. But no one moved. Every face seemed transfixed by the reversal unfolding before them. The student lecturing the professor. The street lawyer dismantling the scholar. Crockett went on, each word deliberate, building a rhythm that felt less like argument and more like revelation. You call yourself an originalist, she said. But the founders you revere wrote those laws with contradictions baked into their ink. They spoke of equality while owning human beings. They promised liberty while denying it to half the population. The law was born flawed, but it's our job to make it fair, not fossilize it. Barrett exhaled, a faint shake of her head. Congresswoman, I don't think that's the problem. Crockett cut in gently. You don't think you interpret. You analyze. You cite, you quote, but you don't feel it. And justice without feeling is just a prettier form of oppression. Even experts later admitted they paused the feed right there. Rewind it, listened again. Her voice wasn't angry. It was clear, almost tender, the way truth sounds when it stops performing and starts meaning. Barrett tried once more to pivot. That's a moving speech, but judicial restraint exists for a reason. Passion corrupts precedent. Crockett smiled faintly. Then maybe precedent needs a little corruption. Because if restraint means standing silent while people suffer, then I'll take passion every time. The audience erupted a murmur, turning into a wave of restrained applause before the chair pounded the gavel for order. Barrett's face flushed. Crockett didn't bask in it. She stayed still, serene, letting the moment belong to the message, not the messenger. You once wrote, she continued, quoting from one of Barrett's opinions, "The law cannot remedy every societal injustice. But Judge, maybe the law can't yet. That's why we're here. That's why I'm here. To make sure it learns how." Barrett looked down, her pen tapping a nervous rhythm against her notes. Her usual arsenal of precedent, technicality, and tone policing had failed her. "Judge," Crockett said softly, "you've spent years teaching that the law is sacred. I agree, but sacred doesn't mean untouchable. It means accountable. And right now, accountability is what this country is begging for." Every word seemed to grow heavier, more resonant. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Social media feeds began flooding with clips, captions, quotes. "A law degree isn't a license to forget the law applies equally." The line trended within minutes. But inside that room, none of that existed yet. What existed was the feeling that something tectonic had shifted. Barrett finally spoke, voice tight. "You're implying that my judicial philosophy lacks compassion." "That's a serious accusation." Crockett didn't blink. "No, Judge. I'm saying compassion shouldn't need philosophy to exist." The audience froze. Even Barrett stopped moving. It wasn't a gotcha. It was a mirror one Barrett couldn't look away from. Crockett straightened her notes, her voice softening. "I didn't grow up believing the law was on my side. I had to fight to believe it could be. That's why I asked these questions. Not to disrespect you, but to remind you that the law doesn't just live in books. It lives on in our lives." Barrett's jaw tensed. She tried to respond, but her voice faltered. The camera caught the slight downward glance, the lost confidence. Crockett continued, her closing cadence rising like an anthem. "You studied law in quiet halls. I practiced it in crowded courtrooms. You read about fairness. I had to argue for it. So when I challenge you, it's not arrogance, it's duty. Because if the law isn't defending the powerless, it's defending power. And that's not justice. That's maintenance." The room broke. Audible gasps turned into a stunned silence that felt almost reverent. Barrett sat motionless, her carefully curated confidence shattered not by shouting or spectacle, but by the weight of reality she'd spent her career editing out. Crockett gathered her papers, her eyes sweeping the room, not triumphant but grounded. "We both serve the same Constitution, Judge. The difference is I still believe it can change." No one spoke. The gavel didn't strike. Even the chairman's authority felt small in that instant. Overshadowed by something bigger, the sound of a nation realizing what accountability could look like when spoken with calm conviction. Barrett finally managed a stiff nod, her lips pressing into a forced smile. "Well," she said quietly, "that's one interpretation." Crockett's reply was almost a whisper. "No, Judge, that's reality." Every phone in the room buzzed. Journalists whispered frantically. On social media, the clip was already surging. Labeled Crockett versus Barrett, the moment truth won. What Barrett didn't yet know was that those four calm, devastating words would outlive the hearing itself. Law students would quote them. Commentators would dissect them. And for millions watching, it wasn't just a takedown, it was validation. For once, dignity didn't just survive arrogance. It dismantled it. And yet, as applause began to ripple quietly through the chamber, Crockett didn't smile. She simply exhaled the look of someone who had carried an entire generation's frustration, and finally, for one unguarded moment, set it down. But what happened next wasn't just applause, it was transformation. The clip spread faster than wildfire in a dry forest of frustration. Within an hour, it was everywhere, timelines flooded, stitches and duets multiplying by the thousands. One user on X summed it up best. Jasmine Crockett didn't just debate. She dismantled an entire mindset. Crockett crushed it, trended at #1 within 2 hours. Though the people wasn't far behind. Even those who had never watched a congressional hearing before were suddenly quoting her line, "A law degree isn't a license to forget the law applies equally." it became more than a clapback. It became a creed, clips replayed on loop on breakfast shows, podcasts, and late-night newsreels. The host's tones varied from admiration to awe. "That was a masterclass in composure," said one legal analyst on CNN. She didn't raise her voice once, and yet, she raised the standard for political discourse. On TikTok, creators remixed the moment into motivational edits. Slow-motion replays of Crockett's delivery synced with orchestral music. One video opened with her quote flashing across the screen, "Truth doesn't need permission." Millions watched, commented, shared. Meanwhile, the conservative pundit circuit scrambled to respond. On cable panels, commentators looked uncomfortable, fumbling to downplay it as performative grandstanding. But even their tone betrayed them, defensive, uncertain, shaken. Because the public reaction wasn't about politics anymore. It was about principle. In the comment sections, people wrote like they were reclaiming something stolen. Finally, one user said, "Someone spoke to us, not over us." Another, "My daughter just asked who Jasmine Crockett is. I told her that's what power looks like when it tells the truth." Hashtags became rally cries. Equal law for all, justice with dignity, the people's lawyer, all born within hours. Influencers, activists, even celebrities joined in. A Grammy-winning artist reposted the clip with a caption, "This is how you fight arrogance with grace." Cable news segments replayed the footage frame by frame, dissecting Barrett's reaction. Analysts zoomed in on the micro-expressions, the tightening jaw, the diverted gaze. "You can actually see the power shift," one commentator noted. "It's the exact moment when institutional entitlement met unfiltered truth and blinked." By evening, major headlines declared, "Crockett's lesson in constitutional courage," the hearing that redefined judicial accountability, when calm became the loudest weapon, even traditionally. Neutral outlets like Reuters and AP couldn't resist the story's magnetism. The narrative wasn't about partisanship. It was about perspective. A public defender turned Congresswoman had stood her ground against the symbol of elite conservatism, and won, not through rage, but through reason. Legal scholars began writing think pieces overnight. "Crockett's exchange with Barrett," wrote one law professor, "should be studied in every constitutional law class, not for what it exposed about Barrett, but for what it revealed about America's hunger for justice rooted in empathy." In contrast, the corridors of conservative think tanks fell silent. Anonymous insiders told reporters the exchange looked bad optics-wise. One even admitted off record, "She played the game better than we did, and she did it without breaking a sweat." But the people didn't just watch, they participated. They claimed ownership. Grassroots organizations used the clip to launch new campaigns on legal access, public defense funding, and judicial accountability. The quote printed on posters, t-shirts, protest signs, "The law applies equally." For once, social media outrage didn't scatter. It is organized. It unified. Crockett's office phones reportedly crashed under the volume of calls. Messages poured in thank yous from teachers, law students, single parents, veterans. People who had felt invisible in the system were suddenly reminded that the law could still belong to them. Late that night, a viral tweet summed it up in one line. Barrett had the credentials. Crockett had the conscience. It was liked 500,000 times before sunrise. Even international outlets covered it, from The Guardian to Al Jazeera. "American democracy," one editorial wrote, "has found its moral voice again, and she speaks softly but carries the truth." Through it all, Crockett stayed quiet. No victory posts, no soundbites. Her silence spoke louder than any follow-up interview could, because this wasn't about her ego. It was about her ethos that truth, when spoken plainly enough, doesn't need to be amplified. It amplifies itself. By morning, one image defined the moment. A still frame of Crockett. Leaning forward, mid-sentence eyes steady, lips curved just slightly, the look of someone reclaiming justice in real time. It was shared millions of times with one caption, "The People's Lawyer." For her supporters, it wasn't just a viral clip. It was vindication, proof that calm, intellect, and authenticity could still cut through noise and privilege. But for the nation watching, it became something deeper, a reflection of who gets to define truth in America. and who finally dares to speak it out loud. And as the applause of the internet slowly turned into a movement, one thing became clear. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken truth to power, she had redefined what power could sound like. But beyond the memes and headlines lay something even more powerful. A moral turning point. When the hearing ended and the cameras powered down, the echo of that exchange lingered far beyond the chamber. It wasn't about who won a verbal sparring match. It was about a principle as old as the Constitution itself. Justice doesn't reside in titles, pedigrees, or ivory towers. Justice lives with the people it serves. Jasmine Crockett's words crystallized that truth. A law degree isn't a license to forget the law applies equally. Simple, yet profound. It reminded the nation that authority does not guarantee morality. The credentials do not confer empathy, and that the law's ultimate measure is not interpretation, but impact. For millions watching, the confrontation became a mirror. Working-class families saw themselves in Crockett, their struggles acknowledged, their frustrations validated. Students recognized the value of courage over conformity. Activists felt a quiet vindication, that speaking truth to power was not reckless but necessary. Every audience member could feel the lesson. Legitimacy is earned through action and fairness, not inherited from institutions or titles. Barrett represented the system as it often appears from a distance, orderly, untouchable, insulated. Crockett reminded the country that the system is only meaningful when it answers to those who live under it. The law is not an ornament to showcase intellect. It is a tool to protect lives, families, and communities. When it fails to do so, it must be questioned, challenged, and corrected. The broader implications were undeniable. Access to justice, equality under the law, representation in governance, these were not abstract ideas anymore. They were urgent, tangible realities. Crockett's stand illuminated the gaps between principle and practice, between what is written and what is experienced. It reframed the conversation from a partisan debate to a moral imperative. It wasn't simply a critique of one judge or one judicial philosophy. It was a declaration that fairness belongs to everyone, not only to those with the authority to interpret it. That truth resonated across communities, political lines, and generations. It inspired conversations in classrooms, in homes, in offices about responsibility, accountability, and the kind of nation Americans want to be. Crockett's approach also offered a blueprint for confronting power. Calm, precise, and unwavering, she demonstrated that righteousness need not be loud to be undeniable. Her restraint became her strength, her moral clarity became her shield, and her voice became a rallying cry. The lesson was universal. Courage is most potent when it combines intellect with empathy, knowledge with humanity. This confrontation was more than a moment in a hearing room. It was a symbol, a reminder that authority must serve, not dictate. That law, when divorced from justice, is hollow. That those who wield power without conscience will always be challenged by those who carry truth in their lived experience. For viewers, the takeaway was both inspiring and empowering. It reminded them that they are not passive spectators of history. Every voice matters. Every act of courage, small or large, contributes to the arc of justice. Crockett's victory was not just personal. It was collective. It belonged to the mothers, the students, the activists, the people who had long been sidelined by systems that claimed neutrality, but delivered inequality. And as reflection gave way to resolve, it became clear. Real change begins when people reclaim what has always been theirs. Authority is transient. Truth endures. Justice is not defined by privilege. It is defined by the courage to insist it applies equally to all. In that light, the viral moment, the trending hashtags, the social media storm, all of it pointed to something deeper. This wasn't mere spectacle. It was a moral awakening, a call to remember that power without accountability is hollow. But courage without fear can reshape the narrative. And that's why this wasn't just a debate. It was a declaration of who defines justice in America. She didn't just destroy an argument. She redefined what a law degree means, not as a symbol of prestige, not as proof of superiority, but as a responsibility. A responsibility to see, to hear, and to serve the people whose lives are shaped by every word, every ruling, every precedent. Intellect without empathy collapses when confronted with truth. And that's exactly what happened in that hearing room. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't stand. She reminded the world that authority can command attention, but it is truth that commands respect. She took a system built on privilege and polished procedure and reflected it back with clarity. The law must protect humanity, not shield status. Every headline, every hashtag, every replayed clip points to the same lesson. Justice is not owned by those who claim it. It belongs to the people. And courage, grounded in honesty and lived experience, has the power to reclaim it. If you believe justice isn't owned by the privileged, it's powered by the people, then hit subscribe. Because this isn't just commentary, it's justice in action. Every share, every like, every discussion sparked by these words amplifies the message. Fairness is earned, accountability is demanded, and the people's voice is non-negotiable. So the next time you watch a moment like this unfold, remember it isn't just about the argument won or the confrontation staged. It's about a reminder that the system can be held to account, that power is temporary, that courage is permanent. Because in that hearing room, Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she reminded America who the law is for.